Thank you very much, Henry, for organizing this event. And I'm really glad that you managed to get two very distinguished scholars, Professor Kerry Brown and Professor Ken Calder, to join us for this event. It shows how much pulling power you have, Henry. I'm very impressed to get such a distinguished panel. I'm going to be very brief and speak for only 5 minutes or so to give, I guess, the listeners a kind of a preview of the book. And I would say that to explain the book, I would make 3 points about in a sense, the 21st Asian century. And the first point I'm going to make, which may sound a bit paradoxical, is that all of Asia should send a thank you note to the West for creating the Asian 21st century. And I say that quite honestly, genuinely, and sincerely, because if the West hadn't succeeded first, if the West hadn't created this magnificent scientific revolution, if the West hadn't launched the Industrial Revolution, if the West hadn't come up with these sort of breakthrough ideas on how to transform society, like Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and free market economics and all these ideas that in a sense propelled the West and made them the strongest and most dominant civilization in the world for 200 years in the 19th and 20th century, are now the same ideas that are actually propelling Asia forward in the world today. So, and the Asians were very intellectually honest. They would admit that if the West hadn't made these major intellectual breakthroughs, maybe we would still be in agricultural feudal societies today. But it's the West that's transformed the world, and it's the West that's transformed Asia. And as an aside, I will also mention that we should also thank Japan for being the first Asian country to modernize and transform itself, because the Japanese transformation also inspired many other countries, the Four Tigers, then subsequently the ASEAN countries, and then China, and then India, and all of Asia opened up. So you can see what a tremendous job the West has done in creating this Asian 21st century. And so this brings me to my second point, which is that at a time when this Asian century launched by the West is taking off, the West should be celebrating the success of Western ideas in Asia. Instead, sadly, the West is doing the exact opposite, and both intellectually and politically refusing to accept the fact that the 21st century will be the Asian century. And I want to also, as a historical aside, mention that the return of Asia was always a natural development, because from the year 1 to the year 1820, the two largest economies of the world were those of China and India. And as you know, I document that in some essays in the book, Asian 21st Century. And so the return of Asia was always going to come anyway. And so this is an inevitable return, and the West should accept it gracefully. But unfortunately, there is, to my surprise, a tremendous amount of resistance to accepting this. In both intellectually, you will still have Americans saying, oh, the 21st century will remain the American century, which I find rather strange. And then, of course, you also have on the political side, a deep reluctance to give up privileged positions that the West has enjoyed in the world order. And of course, Exhibit A is the fact that even till today, despite pronouncements to the contrary, the United States insists that the head of the World Bank must be an American, and the Europeans insist that the head of the IMF must be European. I can tell you in 2009 at the G20 meeting, during the global financial crisis, the West said, no, this is all going to stop. We're going to select leaders of the World Bank and IMF on the basis of merit and no longer the basis of geography. Nothing changed. 12 years have gone by, and we still have the heads of the IMF coming from Europe and the heads of World Bank coming from the United States. This is just one example of the reluctance of the West to accept the fact that this is a different world. So all this brings me to my third point, which is that actually there is a wiser, more intelligent approach for the West to take in the 21st century. And that's why you notice that in my book, The Asian 21st Century, the concluding section, is on multilateralism. And you mentioned that I've been ambassador to UN. I've been ambassador to UN for over 10 years, and I still am. I was then, and I still am, many years later, still a passionate lover of the United Nations. And the paradox here is that the United Nations and its ideas and the UN Charter were essentially created by Western thinkers. It's Western ideas, Western concepts, and the UN General Assembly was conceived to be the parliament of man representing the views of the whole world. And so, in a sense, if you want to create a more balanced world order to reflect the new world, we don't have to reinvent the world. We can just take the 1945 rules-based order that the West created and work with it. And so, in the population of 7.8 billion people in the world, only 12% live in the West, 88% live outside the West. If you want to know what 88% are thinking, you don't have to go very far. Go to the UN General Assembly and use the UN General Assembly as a parliament of man to listen to what exactly the world wants. And the good news is that most countries in the world, especially in Asia, want to cooperate with this rules-based order that the West has created and actually want to have a more stable world order. And you mentioned China. China has become the biggest beneficiary of the 1945 rules-based order. Therefore, it's in China's national interest to preserve this rules-based order rather than to disrupt it, as many fear would happen. So actually, if we do want to create a peaceful and safe Asian century, we don't have to go far. Let's go back to the 1945 rules-based order. And that's the concluding argument of my book, In the Asian 21st Century. So thank you very much, Henry. I'm looking forward very much to the dialogue with this very distinguished panel you've assembled. Thank you.